and welcome to episode 32 of The Agent is In. Today we've got Cody and a special guest, Mike Weilgart, with us. He's been a CFEngine user for a long time, and we thought it'd be nice to have a little chat with him. Hey, Mike, can you introduce yourself and kind of tell us about some of your background?
Sure. Yeah. So, hi, Mike Weilgart. I got introduced to CFEngine by my close friend and mentor Alexei Talelikin, and he was consulting at a Fortune 50 company at the time, and I went in, worked alongside him, where I sort of lived and breathed CFEngine code daily for several years. To the point where could write it in my sleep. I would be wrestling with a thorny, like literally, I would wrestle with some thorny CFEngine problem. I'd be like, how am I going to do this? And I would go to sleep and like wake up with the idea for how to do it. So
Yes,
got a lot of experience, and I was using CFEngine. I think I started at 3.6, might have been 3.5. I think it was 3.6, and I was using it kind of daily up through the release of 3.10. And I don't recall, I think I started using 3.12 as well, but I'm not completely sure about that. Or 3.13, I guess, would have been the LTS.
Actually, 3.12 was the LTS, and we skipped 13.
Okay, right. Because I remember 3.7 was LTS and then 3.10. And then it was usually every 3, but 3.12 was what came to mind. I guess I was right. It was 3.12, huh?
It was. We delayed. Okay. We got busy in that one, and it took longer than we expected it to. And then, rather than have an LTS release be 13, we decided to just wait a little bit longer and release this 3.12.
Nice.
So, what kind of stuff were you? You mentioned like some thorny issues or whatever.
Yeah.
Like what kind of stuff was thorny with CFEngine?
So it's funny because the thorny stuff wasn't really it's hard to recall in looking back at it, because it by and large it was fairly straightforward. Like sometimes it would be like, okay, how am I going to do this in an elegant fashion? But we were automating. So we had CFEngine running on every server in the infrastructure, lab and production, mainly Linux, a few different distros. There were a couple of Solaris servers, and there were Windows servers, but we weren't running CFEngine on Windows. They were kind of like a totally separate, like they didn't have anything in common with how they were managed. They were managed by like different teams and so on. It was like, fine. So we didn't manage the Windows servers, but everything else was in CFEngine. And we did the security. That was kind of the main 2 points that we did were inventory, server inventory, right? And broadly speaking, config management. And so, well, what does config management mean? Well, it can mean anything, right? So application level, OS configuration, security, like corporate security requirements, enforcing those, that was a big one. We did some application level config, but mostly only by request. Like if the developers asked us, application developers would ask us to, then we would. Otherwise, there were at least 20 different application development teams, and we're running on everything. So we could very easily target a CFEngine policy to run only on some particular application, but we didn't do that very often. So that was mostly, like I said, that was just by request. One thing that I'll mention that was funny was sometimes we would enforce a security requirement. Let's say we're going to close all these ports that shouldn't be used. And then, so we have that in place. It's enforced as a policy. And then, some new application developer will be reaching out to us every few months or something saying, hey, can we get CFEngine? They would have found our team because they were trying to do something that they're really not supposed to do. And then CFEngine would break their not really allowed workflow. And then they go, hey, why is this not working? And then they figure out it was CFEngine eventually and come talk to us. And we'd say, oh, yeah, you're not supposed to do that. So it was kind of nice having that enforcement layer, like right when they start developing the application. It's like, oh, you can't use that. You're not going to be using public DNS. You're not going to. We have internal DNS. You're not going to be opening these ports for insecure services. And it wasn't just a policy, a human readable policy somewhere that you'd have to read and follow. It was actually enforced on the servers. So that was nice.
Cool. So what type of things with CFEngine? You mentioned inventory. I guess how did you integrate CFEngine, or in what types of ways did you integrate CFEngine with other systems that they have? So I mean, if you've got inventory, what were you using it for, or like how did you connect CFEngine?
Yeah.
Did you?
Well, we did. So I first will mention one of the most notable use cases for inventory, and like one of the things that's like, oh wow, this is really cool, is actually an out of the box CFEngine. We did a lot of custom inventory code, but even out of the box, like I was there. Heartbleed came out. What was it? There's a couple others that came out. Spectre and Meltdown came out. But Heartbleed, so open SSL, right? So it's like, oh, which versions are, which servers are vulnerable to this? And, and obviously there's like lots of executive level decisions going on about this. And so, our point of contact is we're contracting there. And our executive, can you tell us, which servers are running vulnerable versions of OpenSSL? It's like, yeah, we can get that. It's like, okay, how long will it take? They're thinking like days or weeks. It's like, well, we have all of that inventory information already, accurate to within 15 minutes, right? So we can write a custom query and we'll get you the data in less than an hour, right? And that's padding it. It's like 5-10 minutes. You write the SQL query.
So what kind of I guess what was the response to that? I mean,
they're very, very happy. It's like, okay, good. And it's like it's fast enough that it could feed into whatever corporate press release. We found 2% of our servers are running an affected version, and we're going to get them patched, or whatever press comment they wanted to make. But you asked about custom inventory, and I did want to answer custom, not just like that's out of the box that I was talking about, but so custom inventory. So if you've heard of Centrify.
Oh yeah.
Centrify, the Linux package for joining Linux servers to Active Directory. So you want to know what domain are you joined to? You're joined as what domain, right? There's various custom kind of Active Directory stuff you'd want to know. Which groups are you in? I actually learned Tickle, right? TCL specifically. It's a very simple language, right? But I learned it. I wrote some custom inventory code that I ran from CFEngine on all the servers that were joined with Active Directory for a little piece of custom inventory code. Another custom piece of inventory was kernel tunables. And I actually, you could just inventory all the kernel tunables. What I actually inventoried was, I might have inventoried all of them, come to think of it. I don't remember specifically, but the thing that I was really interested in inventorying was all the places where the current value of the kernel tunable didn't match what was in sysctl.conf. And so there's like little time bombs sitting there for the next time the server reboots. So if somebody goes and manually, adjusts the kernel tunable, and then it's like, okay, and everything works fine, but nobody knows that that's been adjusted. And then the next time the server is rebooted, something doesn't quite work the way it should. Or maybe it's just like runs slower because you changed it. So I'd inventory those discrepancies, and then we could say like, oh look, here's the ones that don't match what's in the running kernel. So
how far did you take that? Did you look to like automatically reload based on the running?
I didn't go to automatically reload. We would look into it. There weren't a whole lot. It was kind of it happened. Like there were enough that it made it worth inventorying, but it wasn't like some massive percentage. It was I would say less than 10% of the infrastructure had
Some drift.
modifications that didn't match, right? And so then we could kind of just like notify the teams who own those servers and say, hey, just so you know, you got this. And they go, oh, yeah, we didn't realize. But it was nice. Now, one of the things we're going to talk about at some point here is comparison to other config management, and specifically Puppet, which I spent a few months working with more recently.
Tell us about it.
Well, I just as a comparison point to start it, it's like the types of problems that are encountered in Puppet versus the types of problems that I was solving with CFEngine. It's like two different universes. Like the sort of the engineering maturity wasn't even close to a point where you could think about stuff like, oh, are my kernel tunables matching what I expect them to be, and so forth. That's not something like, could you do it with Puppet? I guess you could do it with anything, right? You could do it with a shell script, but the tool itself isn't really structured around that kind of engineering maturity. It's unfortunate. So one of the things you'll find if you read anything about Puppet, or you read reviews and so forth, is that the community is excellent, and that was my experience as well. But there's also this kind of frustrating aspect where you can get very rapid response. You go in the Puppet Slack channel, you get very rapid response, but unfortunately, if you're coming from CFEngine and you're used to a very sort of mature engineering-wise approach to doing things and kind of having things automated from the start, a lot of your answers might be like, oh, well, that's not how we do things in Puppet. It's like, you should learn to use Puppet as itself. So I could go on a whole rant about Puppet, and maybe I will at some point here. But let me see what questions you want to ask. We can have some dialogue.
Well, I mean, I'm interested in your war story here. Like what I mean, what can you give us some like more concrete type of example
Sure.
of like
Okay. So config management, ideally, and this is true of CFEngine, it's true of Puppet, it's true of, I think, any config management. It's like most of the time you'd prefer to deal with the normal building blocks like files, file contents, package installations, these sort of things that in CFEngine we have the custom, or not custom, but like the native promise types to do these, right? And most of the time you don't need to fall back on running commands. But sometimes you do, right? It's kind of sometimes unavoidable. And in Puppet, it's really hard. You go to running commands, they're called exec resources in Puppet, and they're not really a first-class citizen in the Puppet language. And the reason for that, it's actually a very, very important architectural difference. So CFEngine, I was so used to thinking with CFEngine, and honestly, I ran into real edge corners. I mean, you've seen some of my bug reports that I would turn in on CFEngine, like weird stuff in the parser. If you do very weird things in your promises, like you can get weird stuff. So I was kind of used to like, yeah, okay, I know how CFEngine is, and I also know what the problems with that are. So it's like it's good, and I didn't know how good I had it until I started using Puppet. And then just by comparison, it's like, oh my God. So CFEngine, everything's local, right? So all the promises and the policy, it's all evaluated on every agent. Puppet, you can do that, but that's not really the direction you're steered in. The ordinary way to do it is you have a Puppet server, and you have your manifest. That's the word. It's not policy. You have your manifests. They're compiled on the server. If you scale out too much, then you're going to need dedicated servers just to compile the catalog. And what that means is it takes the Puppet manifest, the code that you've written, and it takes the facts from the host to which it's going to be applied. And so it's all this data, right? And then it puts the two together, and it outputs a JSON bunch of data, basically saying which policies should do what, right? So it's kind of as though you take all of the conditions, all the conditionals in your code.
Mhm.
This isn't strictly accurate. Like there can be conditionals kind of baked into that JSON structure, but in essence, it's as though you take all the conditionals in your code and you pre-evaluate which way they are going to apply based on the data reported up front.
Is it just the data reported up front, or does it combine that with like other reported information that the host has sent back?
So it's based on facts, right? So in CFEngine, it's a little bit weird to think of it in CFEngine language because you have variables or vars, right? And there's no distinction between, right? Like a var, you can tag any variable for collection and inventory if you're running in CFEngine Enterprise. In Puppet, you have ordinary variables and you have facts, and they're very different.
Mhm.
Because the ordinary variables,
More akin to classes, right?
Yeah, there's this whole object-oriented stuff and the way you pass all of the things as parameters, and then there's the whole hierarchy layer for it's essentially like overriding the variables or overriding the arguments that you're going to pass to classes on a per host or per environment basis, whatever. But the distinction I'm making right now is just between facts, which are calculated ahead of time with custom Ruby code. So you can write your own facts, but you have to write the code that will collect it. And then, there's all the facts that are collected out of the box. Those are facts, and those are the things on which you can base conditional logic of your code. You can't do that with ordinary variables because, so let me just give you an example. In CFEngine, it is trivially easy to condition application of a particular policy or promise based on the local existence of a file on the host that's it's like, of course, right? You don't even think about that as a feature because it's so native to the language. It's like, yeah, you're just going to add a conditional, like if, file exists. It's like no trouble, right? So in Puppet, there's a couple of ways to do that. One is to write a custom fact to collect upfront and ahead of time and send data about the existence of that file to the Puppet server so that it can be taken into account during catalog compilation. And then in the JSON file you send back, you can have accounted for whether that file is there or not. And the other way, which is only allowed if you're running a command, like exec resource or like a commands promise, right, is you can do an only if and run a command to check for the existence of the file.
Oh.
So you can't natively just say only do this, install this file or only install this package if this file exists. It doesn't exist.
Oh, so this is like Bash.
Yeah, it's like you can do it in Bash. But so here's the trick on this is it makes it much harder. So it makes it like it's really hard to do things the right way in the Puppet language because you can only do that if you're writing command directly, and then you might as well just use a shell script, right? So a lot of people can just give up and say, fine, whatever, I'm just going to do it all with commands. And then just another side note on that, in CFEngine, a commands promise by default isn't executed by the shell. So which security-wise eradicates a whole category of problems that you can run into, right? In Puppet, by default, it is run in the shell. You can get around that. It's a little hacky. You have to split it out like you would in C and put all the separate, quoted arguments. So nobody really does that because it's too much of a pain, right? So generally speaking, everything is, all your exec resources are being run in the shell. If you you're supposed to use absolute path names, just like in CFEngine, but because it's all run in the shell, that really only applies to the very first command, and then you put double ampersand, and then you could have a non-absolute path and so forth. So yeah, okay, fine. And then you can still get all the problems with data injection and so forth if you're not careful with your quoting. Fine. So you can take the path of least resistance and just use exec resources, and then you can say like only if. So there's an only if attribute you can stick on. You can only use that for exec resources.
Oh.
So like that's the equivalent of commands promises.
Can't
So
like
you can't do it
condition.
only if you're doing a files resource, if you're doing a packages resource, any other type of resource, user resource, you cannot put an only if. That doesn't exist.
Interesting. What about is that I mean they have custom resources which are like promise types.
They have custom resources. Yeah, you can get custom resource types, but
Can those be qualified like with this additional? I don't know.
so there's ways of doing it, but just the fundamental language building block of just adding a conditional attribute right into the code, which you'd kind of expect in a declarative language. If you're coming from CFEngine, you use this every day, right? You're writing a policy, you'd never do otherwise, like, because that's just natural. Like you can put it in the context line, right? Or you can put it as an only if, and it does the same thing either way. So that's not how it works in Puppet. So as I was mentioning, that's kind of the path of least resistance, is you can use exec resources for everything. That's discouraged, right? So if you're talking to the people in the Puppet forums, it's like, yeah, you really shouldn't just use exec resource for everything. So it's like, okay, so what do you do then? It's like, oh, well, you write custom facts. Okay, fine. The other thing is that you'll get this talk. It's like, okay, I'm trying to install Apache, right? I just want to manage the Apache config, right? I have a very simple, couple, like something that you would do with, let's say, a couple of promises in CFEngine. And it's like, okay, I want to install Apache. You want to get the best practices advice on installing Apache with Puppet. It is, don't reinvent the wheel. Use a module, right? It's like, okay, so look at what a module is, and it's so painful. Oh my god. Okay, so I'm trying to be fair also to Puppet, right? Because it's a different way of doing things from CFEngine. And it's like, it's not necessarily worse or better. And okay, yeah, fine. I think it's worse. But here's the thing. You know how you can do a parameterized bundle in CFEngine, right? And you pass parameter, that's fine, right? For the cases where you're going to use it a couple different ways, right? In Puppet, the state of the art, it's like, oh, you're going to take a well-made module for installing Apache, and you're gonna go ahead and use that, and it will have default values for all of these parameters, so you can just override the ones that you need. Sounds great. The only problem is that most of the modules you're going to look at have dozens of parameters. So now you have to do this additional, instead of just saying, this is what I want it to do. And I know what the config file should look like for Apache. So I'm just going to write that directly, or I'm going to make a mustache template because I'm going to do a couple of different versions for different, and I can easily abstract out what's the differences. It's like, oh, no, now you're going to, instead of kind of doing it the native way with just a sprinkling of CFEngine over the top, where it's like, good, just to abstract out the similarities or the differences or whatever. Instead, you have to learn this additional abstraction layer that somebody else built on top of it. And then it's like, oh, so
Hira?
Yeah, Hira, exactly. Okay. Hira and like the specific parameters for each okay, now I'm going to override this for this server type and for this server type. It's like, okay. And there's a specific, so one of the things I was doing with this was the Foreman proxies for new server provisioning, which, by the way, another of the questions you wrote is what should CFEngine add? I don't know if CFEngine should add provisioning or not, but I will say that because there wasn't any real solution for provisioning of new hosts that's like nicely goes along with CFEngine, we were kind of stuck with Foreman. And because Foreman integrates so nicely with Puppet, I really couldn't make a case for switching to CFEngine because that's how we do our new server provisioning. And it's like it kind of ties in with Foreman sort of inextricably. So that would be really nice if we could say, oh, there's this like much easier to do way of provisioning here. So okay. But I was just talking about the config. So it's like, oh, okay. So you put in like you're gonna do DNS config, or you're gonna do what is it, TFTP for new host, you know, Pixie boots and so forth. And it's like, oh, so I know what I need to change in the config file, but now I go and look through this vast list of parameters. And when I said dozens, that's conservative. This particular one I was looking at, I don't know if it's a good example or not. It was more on the order of 100 different parameters, right? And they could all be individually overridden and so forth. And so you have to dig through and find. Oh my God. Anyway, so yeah, that was kind of painful. And so, you know, the simple difference of like, oh, I want to do it this way on Debian, I want to do it this way on Red Hat-based systems, right? Which is really what CFEngine was first written to, like, abstract those simple differences. So it does it very, very well. And Puppet, you can do it, but it's painful enough that all of the hairy way that you have to go about doing that, really, it's painful enough to deal with that you kind of have to abstract it away from the day-to-day policy writer by sticking it into a module. Right now, you can say like, oh, well, but that's better. It's code reuse. Okay, maybe, but we're not software developers, right? We're trying to administer systems, and we want it to be clear and usable and coherent. So I don't know, this whole, like, if you're just going to use like software libraries and so forth, why don't you go with like Go or Python or like a full featured language, right? Why are you using config management at all? And it should be because it makes your life easier. And if you have to go and use somebody else's abstraction, I don't know. So that's just a different way of doing it. And I know the Puppet people think like, oh, that's great. You don't have to reinvent a wheel. Yeah, but in CFEngine, my experience, you don't need the wheel because the language, the native language itself is workable enough to solve whatever you're trying to do as config management. It's like if you know how to do it manually, and then you're going to write from scratch the CFEngine policy to do it, it's very simple, right? And then if you're going to say, oh, now I want to handle another type of system, you're just going to kind of split that out. Very simple, like mustache templates, and or just, you know, adding the conditional in the code. Like, oh yeah, here's a key structural difference. In CFEngine, the building block is a promise, right? And it's built on promise theory, and there's an actual philosophy and mathematics underlying it that very closely matches what you're actually trying to do. In Puppet, the basic building block is called a resource. And so like a user, user is a resource, right? Or a file is a resource. Now, this sounds like a superficial difference until you realize you're only allowed to state a resource once. So if you want, let's say you want to recursively manage permissions, like or you want to say everything in this directory, nothing should have the setuid bit set. So that's in CFEngine, you do one promise. You'd say, yeah, this entire directory tree, nothing should have setuid bit set. Okay. If you're trying to do recursive file permissions management in Puppet natively without installing a little, I can get into some of the hacky workarounds that exist to solve this problem, but natively, the only way to do it, you turn recurse on. What this does is it adds every single file in that directory tree as a resource mapped by hash, and they all appear in your JSON catalog. So there's a kind of network traffic overhead.
Does that get shipped both directions?
It has to, yeah. So I don't, if you didn't do it as a custom fact, then I don't know how it gets shipped in the first place, but it's like, okay, you're going to have all of these get listed as a.
So then, well, I'm gonna
Yeah.
sorry.
Go ahead.
So
No, it's good.
if you've got a recursive, I mean, a lot of times recursive permissions aren't very clean. Like, okay, fine, you don't want set UID on anything, but oftentimes it's also like, okay, well, I want files that are matching like this pattern
Yeah,
to
you can't do that kind of pattern matching in Puppet.
So if you've got, I don't know,
You can do recursive or you can not do recursive. If you do recursive, everything in the directory tree is getting
has to
added
match.
as a resource in your catalog, which of course just blows up the size of the catalog in the JSON file, and also the time it takes to evaluate the thing. You see, in CFEngine, like CFEngine is written in C, Puppet is written in Ruby, right? So you get there's the interpreter stack. So if the workaround, I mentioned there's a workaround, right? So there is a custom resource type in Puppet. You can go and download it off of the Forge. And what it is it uses find, right? Like the basic shell find tool, right? So you can say, oh, yeah, I want to recursively. So that way it can just add the one resource, right? And then it will actually run find twice, because first it will run it once to see if there's any files that need adjustment, right? And then it will do a separate find to actually adjust the permissions. And then you can be as fancy as you want because you're doing find under the hood, right? But you're only going to get reporting something was corrected or something wasn't corrected because it's one resource from Puppet's perspective.
The find result?
It's like, it's one resource because you did this custom, recursive file permissions.
Not a list in CFEngine. Got it.
Right. So in CFEngine, it's written in C. So CFEngine itself will do the directory walking, and as you mentioned, like there's all this fancy, you can do filtering, you can do regex, you say, I only want this particular way, right? It's like, I ran into this because I was trying to say, okay, take off the exec bit for this whole, it's a directory that had to do with, it's a web server files and stuff. It's like, fine. But there's one directory in there that it had some binaries in it, and we need those to be executable. It's like, okay, so how do you do that? Well, not easily, right? So you can list those individually, and then you try and do the recursive, and then it's going to say, oh, well, you can't, there's an error because the same resource was declared twice. And it's like, okay, because you can't say this. Okay, fine. So you figure out works around, but it's like you're spending your time solving this problem that in CFEngine, it's a whole category of problem that doesn't exist, right? You say, you mapping your requirements to CFEngine promises cleanly. You say nothing should have set UID, but good, that's one promise, done, right? It's recursive. You now don't have to touch it. You have another, it's a directory, it's a file in the same directory tree, and you say this should have contents blah, or this should be zipped up, or whatever, or log rotate, right? It's like any config management, even if you go back to shell, like you can install a log rotate config, right? And Puppet, it's like, yeah, you're gonna take a log rotate module, probably is what you're gonna do, and you're gonna say, yeah, I want to log rotate these files, and I'm gonna have to like use hira to like override the list of which directories I want to do and override all the parameters that are going to end up finally in your log rotate config. And CFEngine, you can do that, but you could do it more easily with a mustache template for the log rotate config. But you can also do it natively with a single promise, right? And just say tidily delete the stuff that's in this directory that's older than X number of days or whatever that matches this regex. Like you very fancy natively, right? At the efficiency of C, as though you were running find or some other, basic system utility, custom designed for the purpose.
Are the modules primarily comprised of like the Puppet manifests, or are they primarily comprised of like custom Ruby?
It's custom. Well, I mean, so the manifests are Ruby, right? But it's custom. This might vary, so I haven't looked at a wide variety of them, so little grain of salt on this. But the ones that I've looked at, it's mostly a lot of Puppet manifests. It's like, so it's kind of all of the, like, oh, you want to deal with Debian, or you want to deal with Red Hat, and so kind of all of this stuff that's very easy to do natively in CFEngine language is hard enough in Puppet. It's like you can do it, but it's painful enough it's easier to, like, somebody else did it, you don't ever want to do it again yourself. So it's like, good, you're just going to use a module.
Generally, the expectation is that people are not writing a lot of custom manifests. Is that the general expectation?
It's that you're going to try and make your manifests reusable. It's sort of like, I can kind of see the perspective on it, because, you know, it's like, yeah, you want to have your infrastructure kind of standardized, you want to make your code reusable. Like, okay, but like, the thing is that I've dealt with a Fortune 50 company and tens of thousands of servers on a single CFEngine code base, and I didn't ever feel any pain from not having modules, because it's easy enough to write the manifest to do it. Sorry, man, now I'm mixing my terminology. It's easy enough to write the bundle to do it with native CFEngine code, that it's kind of like, oh, like the requirements, the human readable requirements translate very directly into CFEngine policy. So can you reuse it? Yeah. But honestly speaking, when I was operating on this day to day, if I needed to do something and somebody else had already done the CFEngine policy for it, I would trim it. Like, I would take theirs and I'd say, yeah, we don't need this, we don't need this, we don't need this. We're only trying to do this. And so we kept our code base a little bit leaner that way. And I guess there's a sort of a philosophical thing there on, like, do you want to, you know, actually understand everything that's running in your config management code base, or do you just want to kind of take something someone else wrote and trust that it's probably more or less what you want? So
While you were away in Puppet Land, or whatever,
yeah,
like, I don't know, have you played with CFEngine build? I mean, because, you know, it kind of is the successor to the Design Center project from a few years back. And I mean, it's the same idea as like Puppet Forge, or, you know, NPM.
yeah.
Or
So I haven't played with it. I did look up and I see, is CFEngine build that website repository with all of the pre-written like example code and so forth?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of so it's build.cfengine.com, and then there's a bunch of modules, and modules are CFEngine policy often, which is either, you know, pre-written, and like you said, perhaps with a bunch of defaults,
Perhaps
and
with default, yeah.
perhaps with a bunch of,
superficially, it's similar. Like,
variables that you can override.
Here's the thing. I looked at that and it's clean. It's like fine. You get like one, you know, you might have like one standalone CFEngine policy file and maybe a mustache template that kind of accompanies it, right? It's like, now I didn't look at all of them, so I don't know how representative were the examples I looked at on the CFEngine, but they're like clean. It's like, yeah, that's more or less how I would have written it. You know, sometimes it's like, yeah, okay, there's a couple of options in here I don't need. I don't really mind, because it's not going to expand you don't have a catalog. In Puppet, you see, you might have like a much bigger catalog than you needed, because there's stuff in there that you didn't need. But it's a superficial similarity. So Puppet is very opinionated about your directory structure. So in CFEngine, people do their own directory structure. You kind of like import the really, it's promises.cf, right? And your main bundle. And that's really the only necessity. And then everything else is kind of like, yeah, you can structure it however you want. You have this flexibility and so on. And Puppet, I think if you told a Puppet engineer that, they would say like, oh, but how you're going to get so disorganized and so on. So not really, right? So in Puppet, what you have is every module has its own little directory tree. And they really have to have their own directory tree. Like, this isn't just a convention. Their stuff is going to break in weird ways if you don't do this. And you have to, and you're going to have a manifest subdirectory, and you're going to have a file subdirectory, and you're going to have a template subdirectory. And I think there might be another one that I'm missing. But definitely those. And your manifest, you don't really have a lot of like, you can't reduce it very much. In CFEngine, you can kind of like you can put directories in where they make sense, but you can also just have all of your policy more or less flat if that's what makes sense. And I can just hear the Puppet people saying now, it's like, well, you can have a flat directory structure in Puppet too. It's like, yeah, sure. And then it's going to take it all in alphabetical order, and it's all gonna, they don't have the inputs, like kind of the bundle sequence. It's gonna be like, yeah, everything there. So in everything in your manifest directory is going to get kind of added and then treated as though it were in one file. And I mean, you can do that in CFEngine, right? If you have an auto run, right? And auto inputs and stuff, but that's the default, unless you specifically move stuff out so it's not in your manifest directory. I ran into this painful conflict between what you can do and what you should do, because Puppet made a lot more things configurable than really need to be configurable. So you get like the location where the files are looked for is configurable, and the location where the config file that tells you where to look for the policy files, the location of that config file is also configurable. And then some of this stuff is overridable via Hiera, and Hiera is pretty much infinitely configurable. So you kind of trying to look for like, where is a single source of truth? This is just starting from scratch. Like, okay, here's my existing infrastructure. Where should I be looking for stuff? And in CFEngine, it's like you start from promises.cf, and everything else is either going to be explicitly listed in there or it doesn't happen, right? Because the binary just says, look at promises.cf. I mean, you're thinking of the exceptions, right? You're thinking of def.json, right? And like reading stuff in. But here's the thing. That has to be explicitly named somewhere in policy to read it in, right? Imagine. No. Oh, is that not true anymore?
Def.json is loaded if it is adjacent to your input file, your first your policy entry file.
Okay.
So if you're down in temp and you've got a CFEngine file in temp, and you have a def.json in temp, and you run that CFEngine file, it'll load that def.json.
Okay, so that's part of the binary then.
Yeah, so it's initially in like 3.7.0, I think, is when def.json was maybe first introduced.
Yeah.
At that point, it was parsed by policy, and then we quickly figured out that we needed the point of def.json was to more easily facilitate the separation of the data from the policy, because in CFEngine, everything historically just goes into the policy. And so you might have policy with like a whole bunch of packages listed out in this policy file, and then to make some simple change to something, somebody's got to be familiar with the CFEngine language. And from our experience, like organizations that successfully scale globally and things like that, they have separation of data so that a more junior person can come in and edit a CSV or a JSON or something that is kind of agnostic, or that you can more easily generate from some other system.
Which anyway,
I needed the data early.
Totally. I think you would actually have an interesting time looking at Hiera, just for it's sort of interesting because CFEngine in a lot of ways like was the pioneer, and then Puppet is kind of following in the footsteps of CFEngine, and Chef and so forth following in the footsteps of CFEngine. In actual fact, Puppet, I read, was founded by somebody who had studied, like he'd done some CFEngine.
Luke was a CFEngine community member. Like he wanted to change the way things were working. I mean, he forked CFEngine 2 for a while. Like he worked on that before he had success with Puppet. I mean, I started with Puppet.
Yeah.
I mean, I thought Puppet was amazing. I thought it was great. When I first encountered it, I hadn't heard of CFEngine. I encountered Puppet, and I was like, this is definitely great. And then I moved to another company, and
so I want to hear your experience and when you shifted from Puppet to CFEngine. Now you got me really curious.
Yeah, I mean, that was, gosh, over 10 years ago, maybe 15-ish years ago or something like that. When, I mean, I found Puppet, and Puppet was like 0.2
Okay.
or something, like, pre 1.0, and it was great. Like the first environment I used it in, I had some differences. I mean, we had multiple platforms, different versions, things like that, but Puppet was great. I mean, it really changed some of the way that I approached like managing infrastructure. And then I moved to another company that was much larger, and there was much more variety in the systems. Solaris, Spark, old Unix, so many different versions of Linux. Like RHEL 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 was maybe there at that time. I don't know. It was probably there around. I don't think 7 had been released or anything like that.
Definitely
but,
not.
Yeah, I tried to introduce Puppet there. I used Puppet with pretty good success for like one environment that we built out. But when I tried to take it further, like I ran into issues with SSL and Ruby SSL back then. That was painful, and then it was kind of slow. But I still thought it was great. And then like I went to Lisa in maybe 2010, and Mark had a session. Mark Burgess, the original author of CFEngine, had a session on CFEngine, and I'm like, all right, I'm gonna go to this and see what this is about. By then I had heard of CFEngine. I went and listened to him, and I mean, I really was enamored by the knowledge management capabilities inside of CFEngine. A lot of the stuff that I worked with, people were long gone, and we're 6 wikis down the rabbit hole of where the information was stored at the time that those systems were deployed. And so, having this ability to, have declarative documentation about the system, and then the thing that, I mean, the simple stuff in CFEngine that I thought was super cool was like the comment attribute and promises, the promisee, the stakeholder attribute, where you can like attach this metadata and kind of just with super little effort kind of link the things that are related. And it seems silly initially, but I don't know, I felt like that stuff paid off much later, because then I would return to something after I learned it and documented some of these little relationships in the system, and then the next time I had to return to it, it wasn't like, well, where was the wiki from 6 years ago? Because we've migrated a few times, and we didn't necessarily migrate all the data. Whoever was migrating which is very different from active documentation. Puppet and the other config management, similar in the same way. Like, this is the thing that is,
it's similar, but it's missing as a concept. Like you get into Puppet and they don't have this comment or meta attribute or meta promise type, for that matter, which documents the whole bundle. So the thing is, in my experience also, you talk to people who haven't experienced the CFEngine, they don't really get it about what is. It's like, okay, comment attributes are fine, but you can put inline comments, right? And there's no real distinction. It's like, yeah, fine, put an inline comment, right? But no. The comment attribute appears when you're making reports about the changes to the system. So you say, hey, we changed the system, the file content, and you don't get that in Puppet. It's like, oh, the file contents, should be thing and has been updated, right? But it doesn't tell you why. And that's baked into CFEngine because you have the content attribute. It says, we're changing this, and it says, needs to have this because whatever, right? And it will tell you why. So actually, and that's one thing I wanted to mention there is, I think that's a thing to beware of when you're going with def.json. And I know you're a big fan of def.json, and I do see the need for it in separation of data. But here's the trick. You lose that comment attributes. Oh, you don't lose out on it. So how are you putting comment attributes in JSON?
Yeah, so the first specification for def.json, you do lose comments.
Okay, so
But
it's been a while since and
yeah,
just to kind of caveat my whole speech here, we at the time when I was like def.json was introduced while I
it was
was
new. Yeah,
actively we had an existing code base that was working fine. We didn't really need def.json in our infrastructure. We were expert CFEngine policy writers. It was kind of like fine. So I
right.
didn't majorly use it myself. I do see the validity for it. You might look at Hira and how that works in Puppet and so forth to kind of see if there's lessons to be learned there. But be wary of. I think there's also lessons to be learned in Hira about how to overcomplicate things.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some limitations with def.json and merging. So there's the
But
newer,
tell me how do you solve the comment?
so the newer
Meta.
format for def.json, which is supported from like 3.18.0 on.
Okay.
So all the current LTS releases support it and have for years. But instead of using vars inside of the JSON, you use variables, like the name of that object changed. Or you can use vars, it still works, but there's a new one called variables. And if you use that instead, it's a much more structured object. So then you can add a comment attribute and a meta attribute inside of like the variable that you're specifying. You can target the namespace, the bundle, variable name, then you can specify the value, the meta tags that are applied to it, and comment. And those things go into the same spot that if you were to have written it in policy. So it's not like it's not coming out in the logs. It's still coming out in the logs in the same places.
So I'm going to make a comment. I'm going to be a Luddite on this one. My observation of config management, certainly true with Puppet. It seems to be you're describing it. Any config management system, like look at CSS for God's sake. CSS, and that's not really config management, right? But it's like you end up with like, oh, we're going to have this simple way declarative of whatever, right? And then it becomes its language in itself that you then need to add an additional language for your data. And it's like, well, that's what the CFEngine language is supposed to be in the first place. So I would like if I were in charge of CFEngine as a project and design, sort of decisions and so forth, I would be saying, well, now hold on a second. We already have CFEngine declarative policy language. We can declare vars. We can put meta attributes, Like you can, I think, what is it? A common bundle that can only have vars and classes, right?
It can also have reports, but
okay, fine.
Those aren't actuated unless the bundle is explicitly actuated.
Right. So, but fundamentally, def.json could be replaced without loss by a common bundle.
Yeah, sure. You can def.json. The point of def.json is again to separate the data from the policy. You can absolutely, it's way more powerful to define your variables and classes in policy because you have all of the freedom.
Here's the problem. You add this layer of like, here, we can get the data this other way, right? And that way we can have it early. And it's like, okay, this is awesome. And, and it's less powerful, but that's okay, right? The progression, the natural progression over time is going to be, okay, well, but now we're missing meta attributes. Oh, okay, we'll change the structure of def.json. Now we can have meta attributes and comment attributes. Okay, fine, that's good. Now later, the natural progression, you're going to sooner or later run into the fact that it's not as powerful. And it's like, oh yeah, because we can't do this, we can't do that. So let's add this feature in. And I think you could better, from a long-term view and design standpoint, just say, you know what? We're not going to do def.json. We're going to make it possible to do with a common bundle. You could even say, we're going to have def.cf, and I think Golang, the Go programming language, I think they do really well in this respect of like very cautious about making changes. They make them in a way they're very strict at first, right? So you can only do it in just this way because that gives them the maximum flexibility in the future while allowing full backward compatibility. And so they're very cautious about adding things. And I think you could say like, we're only going to have a common bundle. it's going to be in def.safe. It's going to get parsed super early, right? It's going to super early so it can be used for everything else, right? And you could even say like for this initial pass, we're going to disallow functions. We're going to disallow all kinds of things, right? And so so it's like a subset of the CFEngine language. So then you could easily expand that subset later and maintain full backward compatibility as you find you need things, but then you're not adding another language. I'll tell you another frustration I ran into with Puppet was the config files. You get into Puppet and it's like, oh, well, there's this config file and this config file and this, and it's like, okay, but hold on a second. This is a config management language. Why am I using like 8 different ways to configure my config management language? Why isn't it configured with Puppet, right? So, and CFEngine, at least as of when I was using it, really hadn't gone down this route of like, oh, let's add in another kind of language, another config. It's like the config files for CFEngine for controlling how it works and how, which files are served and everything else. It's all CFEngine policy. It's like it's turtles all the way down. There's, the server is configured according to the CFEngine policy. And the agent is run according to CFEngine policy. And CFExecd does whatever it does according to what's in CFEngine policy. And that's all there is. And you don't have like, oh, yeah, and then there's also this JSON file over here and this YAML file over here. Oh, and we also have an INI file here. And then there's this other, and that's merged with
That's
JSON.
What's common in infrastructure use that we see, right? So like as people are integrating CFEngine in the environment, well, at least, 4 cases of large scale, which is kind of where CFEngine is typically highly prized, is very large scale because it does scale pretty easily.
Yeah.
I completely lost my train of thought. Which is
well, so I was talking about JSON and YAML and INI, and then and they merge in a particular way, and then we have another config file to say what is the merge order or merge preference, and this is kind of a natural progression, and as far as I've observed, this is not a scientific hypothesis. It could probably be stated as one, but I think that any sort of configuration system over time will grow in complexity to a point where you need another configuration system to manage how do you configure the first one. And I think this is an anti-pattern. I think it's a natural progression. It's something to avoid. And the thing I like about CFEngine, or one of the things I like about CFEngine, is the native policy language itself is powerful enough is really the wrong word, because, any Turing complete language, et cetera, can write all your config code in Python or in Turing machines or brainfuck or whatever you want, right? But it's powerful enough, it is pragmatic enough, and it is concise enough that you really can just use CFEngine policy and you don't need another language on top of it. So I think that's one of its strengths. And I have long been a little bit leery of the def.json as far as progression away from the simplicity of just using CFEngine policy.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess the point with def.json was to sort of provide a path for this separation of data, because 3.7, 3.6, right? That's when 3.5, that's when CFEngine introduced support for structured data.
Yeah.
Better, right? So like JSON, YAML, CSVs.
And it is brilliant. You can parse it in, you read it in very, very easy.
Right. And that's because it already had, capabilities of like parsing bespoke file formats and things like that into data structures that it would use. But, and, the advice that we give based on the results that we see is that successful deployments have more separation of data from the policy.
Yeah.
And as we talk to people about, where is the information in your infrastructure that we can leverage for your policy, right? So like information about what hosts are supposed to have or what they're supposed to look like, or, whatever the information is, any information that can be used to figure out what's the proper config for the machine. How do we securely share that with the appropriate machines and make it so that they can access the information that they need to make the decisions that they need to make?
Yeah.
Because CFEngine makes so many decisions, kind of, it naturally pushes that to the edge. And in a lot of those conversations, it's like, well, what do I do? And it's like, separate your data. And then it's like, well, what? And it's like, well, you could use a CSV, you could use a JSON. So many choices.
Right.
And so many people, like, that's a cognitive burden to have to make the choices. CFEngine gives you all this choice for, what you want to do, how specific you want to make something, but at the same time, you have to make those choices. CFEngine doesn't provide a whole lot of prescriptions for, like, this is the way that you do something. It's kind of always pull, never push. That's kind of a rule. And like, does it work? And is it efficient?
Yeah.
Like, those are kind of the priorities, like. So def.json was really introduced as that because prior to def.json, we did have def.cf. And that is where a lot of these settings kind of centrally collected so that somebody could go figure out how to change, behavior instead of having to modify a bunch of different places. And we also saw that, modifying these files that are by default then cause additional burden when it's time to upgrade. And then you're looking at diffs of files that maybe you're not super familiar with.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, we have, a way to feed data into the, into the agent where you don't deal with that policy evaluation and all the context. It opens the door for another system to generate that data, or it can be hand maintained. And you don't have to use it. But if you want to preload the data based on something else that you have, that gives you kind of that direct path. Then it's implemented in the C directly, so it's pretty fast. Kind of like that's where that comes. And then you get to policy upgrades. Now you've got this file where maybe a bunch of high-level settings are predefined. That's not a vendored file. So you can just, net replace your policy, from the default policy framework. You can just drop it in if you haven't modified anything, and then that didn't touch your def.json, so it's left unperturbed. So policy framework upgrades are a whole lot easier.
Yeah.
And then, kind of tying in with all that, then is where CFEngine build comes in, and it's just the same type of forage situation as, anything else, where it's like, okay, well, I want to construct my policy set from these pieces, and I don't necessarily want to have to write all this policy. Somebody else wrote this other policy that does enough job.
It's very funny because there's a sort of convergence, a sort of natural convergence on this. Like, okay, someone else wrote the code, and I'm only going to deal with the config. The funny thing is, though, that I think that it's a kind of natural progression, right? I mean, you have the same thing in Puppet, right? With Hira and modules, and it's like pre-written stuff, so you can just drop it in. You write your Hira files of like the data that's going to get merged in, and then you kind of don't have to worry about how it's implemented or what kind of nonsense is going on under the hood. You can just kind of ignore all that. But you kind of look at any sort of system. It's like, oh yeah, I want to change the behavior of this system, so I'm just going to change its config. And, let's say Apache, right? It's like, instead of, doing all sorts of custom logic myself, I'm going to install a module, right? And then I'm going to just configure the module. I'll just have my config file. It's like, oh, okay. Well, the config file there, it's like, oh, well, that's kind of hard to manage myself and so forth. So I'm going to get config management to do it. Oh, okay. But then the config management is kind of hard to write. So I'm going to use somebody else's pre-written code that does the config management of my Apache installation, right? And then I can just configure my config management system by using either def.json if you're using CFEngine, or Hira if you're using Puppet, right? And now I can put in my config here that will configure my config management system so that it will configure my Apache server. it's kind of like at some point you have to say, we're stopping here, right? We're going to manage this directly ourselves. This is the layer that is intended for humans to manage and write and consume and so forth. And the reason why I'm not see, I see it as a natural progression, but I still am a little bit I saw def.json and CFEngine. The reason is because the CFEngine policy language, unlike Apache config language, unlike Puppet, unlike JSON, right? The CFEngine policy language was actually written with this knowledge management concept in mind of this should be the thing that humans can write and read easily. And it should actually make it easy to kind of abstract all of the complexities of the underlying system in a way that the humans can actually deal with it. And
So-
that language design and being specifically intended for humans is something that the other languages don't. So I feel like if it just gets kind of lost in the chain of turtles of, one thing configuring another thing configuring another, and you CFEngine policy language is kind of regarded as just something just like anything else that's kind of in the middle, I think it's a bit of a shame because it loses that really unique aspect of CFEngine, of the knowledge management feature of the language itself. So that's where I would, that's kind of, I might even be more of a, what's the word? It's not advocate. It's it had religious connotation. What?
Champion, zealot,
champion. There's another word. Evangelist. That's right.
fervent
I might be a little bit more of an evangelist of the CFEngine policy language, just as such, even than you are, from the student. But yeah, I think that the language. So but yeah, there's natural progression. People want to
love
data.
the CFEngine DSL.
I know.
I enjoy writing CFEngine policy, but are you making the case? I mean, you were like, at some point you got to draw the line. I mean, are you making the case that like CFEngine should just be like done? Period.
No.
Complete stop.
What I'm making
we reached.
What I'm making the case for is that you should be very, very leery of anything that smacks of trying to automate your CFEngine installation and policy itself by some other means. It's like,
so what did you like? So then, what do you think are?
Yeah.
What is your advice for best practices with CFEngine then?
So the fundamental thing that I really think is if you're going to write code in any language, you really need to understand the language you're writing. This already, I'm aware, is not what people do all the time in the industry. And now there's AI, just to make it even take it one step further, right? We won't get into that, but there's a long tradition. You get into shell scripting, and the number of people who actually understand the shell scripts that they write is an unfortunately small percentage. The number of shell scripts you'll find in production that clearly the author had no idea what they were doing is unfortunate, right? So there's no real way around that except like so I heard a quote one time, which is a really good one. The difference between an amateur and a professional is that a professional understands what he's looking at, and an amateur doesn't think he has to. And that's about the only difference. And I think that's just a really brilliantly insightful point. So as a first best practice, I feel like that's table stakes. You're going to deal with the language. You need to understand what language you're dealing with. But as far as CFEngine itself specifically, I would also make a comment. Make use of promise theory in your logic. You can write things in CFEngine that are a lot more bulletproof than you get in other config management systems, because you have this idea throughout the whole structure. The kept, not kept, and repaired is throughout the language. Even if you're doing a commands promise, right? You can specify which exit statuses mean kept, not kept, repaired. You can't do that in Puppet, by the way. There's a lot more limited features there. But so one thing that anybody who's dealt anything in config management has probably done at some point is dropping a flag file to represent that something else was done, right? Everybody does it sooner or later. It's really not a good idea. And the reason is for promise theory reasons, right? You don't actually any longer have a convergent system because you've decoupled, you know, like you want to, let's say you say, I want this package installed, right? I want this package installed. I want this service to be started. And then let's say you're dealing in Puppet and you don't really have an easy way to tell if the service is running the way it's supposed to be. So you just say, you know, fine, I'm going to skip that for now. I'm just going to say, start the service and then create this flag file. And then if the flag file is present, then I won't run this start service command, right? The exec resource. So, okay. So now if something kills, let's say the killer or something else, for whatever reason, the service is no longer running, the flag file is still there. Now your config management is no longer convergent. So you've now made it into a initial install and initial setup only. And in CFEngine, you see, anybody can do an initial install. It's very easy. You can do it in any language. You can do it manually. If you're doing it like the advantage you get with automation, some people think, is now I don't have to run the same commands on 1,000 servers. So I'm just going to put it in a little script. Now the script will do all this. That's fine, but all that gets you is your initial install. And if you actually take the intention of CFEngine is to have CFEngine be the smart robot that knows how your system is supposed to look like, how is it supposed to be running, and it makes it that way. And to accomplish that, it requires a little bit of extra thought, but not a whole lot of extra work. So let's say you're trying to, you say, okay, we want to, let's say you're doing some kind of upgrade or migration of your internal application. You say, yeah, we need to pause everything, blah, blah, blah. And then we need to create this new database table. Okay. So that, depending on the size of your infrastructure and whether or not you still have old servers around later, might make sense to do it as a one-shot, you know, you don't bother to make it convergent, so forth. If you're dealing with, one second. If you're operating at scale, you not only have some servers that didn't get the message initially, but you even have servers being created using an old image sometimes. You have, you know, it can take a while to get old pieces out of the infrastructure because there's like many different places where servers are getting created. You got this massive organization. There's like, oh, they're getting provisioned here and there and all over the place. And so then you really do want to have something convergent. You want to say, all right, we're going to look for the existence of the table. Like do a commands promise. Find out, the database might not be the most perfect example, but it's like, try to make the logic of your CFEngine policy actually match what you're really trying to do, right? You'd say, okay, how can I tell, if I'm troubleshooting a system, how can I tell if it's the way it's supposed to be? It's like, oh, well, you know, I mean, you can check for this file and that's a good indicator, but what you really want to know is if this service is running and it's listening on this port and you know, and that tells you that the service is really okay. So good. Don't go with the simple, you know, not really authoritative answer. Look for the service, look for the port it's supposed to be listening on. And if it's not there and not listening, then take the appropriate action. So CFEngine policy language makes it much easier to do that than any other system. But you can, just like you can with any other system, you can ignore all of the features the language gives you, and you can just reduce CFEngine to being a dumb shell script. And it's a shame to do that, right? You don't want to do that. So that's my best practice, is look at what is the system really supposed to look like, what tells you if something is really broken, and look at the authoritative source as close as you can, and then take your conditional policy actions based on that.
One of my most frequently and maybe favorite things to say, like when I'm reviewing policy.
Mhm.
I think one of the most common things that I see that drives me nuts
Mhm.
is like I've got two promises, a service and a config file. And if the config file changes, I want to restart the service.
Mhm.
And the most common thing that I see is on the config file promise will be like, if repaired, define restart service.
Mhm.
And then after that, you go down and look at services, and it's like, if restart service is defined, run the restart command or whatever, right? Restart the service. And it's like so repetitive, and you lose all of the context about why
Yes.
you're restarting the service when you're reading the policy. I mean,
Right.
it makes no difference at the end. It'll trigger, but
I want to say how I would do that, and I'm curious if it matches how you would.
go
So I
ahead.
would say I would define the class if I needed to fix the config file. And first of all, one place I thought you were going is if the config file management is too dumb, so it doesn't, it like takes comment changes as being actual changes and so forth. But we'll leave that aside. Let's say you've got your config file management smart, so when that promise says repaired, it actually changed something important. Fine. I would define the class as being something like, config file changed or config file repaired or so on. And then you just have and I wouldn't even do it with the commands promise for the service restart unless I really had to. But most of the time you could do it with the services promise. And then you say context, so-and-so config line repaired, restart.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly what
Yeah.
I recommend. It's always, with classes, when you name classes, I try to name classes that describe the state
Something that is true. Yeah.
that
Not
the label
not
is attached to, right? So
yeah.
if you change the config file, yeah, it's config file repaired, or the specific configuration file that you're repairing, depending on how you write your policy or whatever.
Yeah, so best practice. Class name should represent a true statement. It should never represent an action. It's like
and that gives
having
you the ability in there because some services allow you to validate a configuration file.
Yeah.
So that you can actually, okay, I've got this change, I've rendered this new configuration file, great, but you could also check it to see if it's a valid configuration
valid config file, right?
Yeah. Right. So then you can know that, like, oh, I'm not restarting the service when the config file is repaired and when it's not valid, or only restart it when it's repaired and valid. And, yeah, I don't know. That's
totally. Yeah, it's actually funny because classes, I'm curious if you ever sloppily define them as Booleans if you're talking to someone who doesn't know CFEngine. I don't.
I mean, I say that because it's in the documentation, but they're not. It's not an absolute. I mean,
well, so here's what I say. A Boolean in most languages has three possible states. It can be true, it can be false, or it can be name not defined. Right?
Yeah.
Undefined variable. And that's classes in CFEngine are always true if they're defined. So it's really just true or false because it's defined or not.
Yeah, I usually qualify it additionally with like a class is either defined, not defined, or not defined yet. Because in CFEngine, you define classes as the policy evaluates, and all classes are classes. I mean, so
sure. That's
depending
another point, by
on
the way. That's
star.
another point I wanted to get into on Puppet is because the facts are all collected up front, you can't really chain stuff that's based on custom facts. Like you can chain this promise on this resource on this resource, but you can't do this sort of fine-tuned stuff where it's the other funny thing is in terms of network fault tolerance. This is something. It's funny how this connects because it's like, oh, we're talking about variables, but yeah, variables gets into facts and Puppet. But so Puppet, if you're talking to the most frustrating part about talking to Puppet fans was that they don't, the ones that I was talking to, they didn't seem to see the difference in the feature that I'm talking about. Like, it's like they don't know what they're missing. If you're familiar with article, I don't remember if it was Joel Spolsky or there's the one about Blub, you know, the theoretical programming language of choice. And you talk to somebody who's a programmer in Blub, and they know that the less capable programming languages aren't as good because they're missing this or that feature in Blub. And they look at like a more capable programming language, and they compare it to Blub, and Blub is what they think in. So they're like, I don't see why I would need that. You know, I do just fine in Blub. So that was the most frustrating thing talking to people at Puppet, because so it's like, okay, network fault tolerance. You want your system to work even if it loses connectivity to your policy server, or in Puppet language, Puppet server.
Master.
Well, so it's like, oh yeah, well, we have that because we cache the catalog. We cache the catalog, and we can reuse the catalog if we can't fetch a new one. It's like, yeah, but that catalog was compiled based on facts, and your facts are out of date. So it's not really accurate anymore. It might be okay, it might not be okay. Who knows, right? In CFEngine, so you can do all this sort of logic. It's like, if this is, you know, only this service should be running, right? And you say, if and nothing should be listening on this ports, and if this package isn't installed, then nothing should be listening on this ports, whatever. You say this package should be installed, and only once this package is installed should we do this. And if the installation is repaired, then we need to refresh this other thing. So you can have all of this kind of logic, and it's not cached. You see? So you can do a certain amount of chaining of Puppet resources one to the next, but if you're trying to base anything on custom facts, automatically it means you're not network fault tolerant. Like, it automatically means you're going to have stale data if you're trying to apply a cache policy. Anyway, so to your point about classes, it's like, yeah, Boolean not defined, defined, or not defined yet, right? It's like, well, if it's a fact in Puppet, it all happens before you're actually applying the thing. So it's really going to be one way or another, because you can't update a class. So you can't define a Boolean in Puppet based on the outcome of a particular resource, because the resource gets applied after the whole catalog was already compiled. So anyway, there's just, it's this structural, it's just a different way of thinking. And when you're used to thinking in terms of, I want to run everything on the system, I want the system to know how it's supposed to be, and then you try and apply that to Puppet, it doesn't really fit as a mental model, because there's this whole thing, oh, we're going to collect the facts, we're going to send them to the central authority. The central authority is going to take our, I'm just going to take it over into economic planning, right? It's going to take our local reports on, it's because it's a centrally planned economy. It's going to take all of our local reports on what is the prices at the local store, and how much wheat production, and what's the weather like. It's going to take all of these reports, and the central authority is then going to make all of the decisions about how everything is going to be, and it's going to send this out as an order, which is our catalog, and then we're going to apply that locally. And then if we can't reach central command, we're going to keep on using that set of orders, which may no longer apply, but we don't have any autonomy. We can't make any decisions locally. So it's a very different mental model, even though superficially you can find similarities.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, they're very, very different. I mean, I'm wholeheartedly in this distributed camp and decisions at the edge, and so sometimes it's hard to, you know, come from the other perspective. But I mean, there's always this balance of, you know, where can you make the decision? Where is it most efficient? Where is it most effective? And I feel like when I'm working with CFEngine policy and infrastructures, you know, that's kind of a top line conversation. Like when we're talking about something, you know, it's like, how could we know this thing? Where can we know it from? Who else should be able to know that? And, you know, like, what are we going to do if we can't find out, or if, you know, we can't update our knowledge? So kind of that low level understanding of, like, I mean, the promise, and
Mhm.
stakeholders and all the promise theory things kind of
Exactly.
play.
It comes back to promise theory because that is the mental model that, like, once you've started looking at system configuration through the lens of promise theory, it's impossible to look at it any other way because the model fits so exactly. It's like that is, yeah, it's like, okay, the system has to do all the decisions have to occur locally, even if it's the decision to trust a central authority and obey its commands. Because it's like the promise theory model, it's not like just for some sort of systems, it's for all systems, even centrally managed ones. Because in a centrally managed system, the mathematical model, you still have to decide to obey that. It's like, oh, well, we don't want I've actually heard this argument against it. We don't want our systems to be autonomous. Like, we want them all to follow central authority. It's like, okay, I mean, that's fine, but the mathematical model of it still applies because if somebody compromises root on one of your servers, they're going to stop it from accepting commands from your central authority. And now your mental model that says that all decisions come from a central authority suddenly no longer applies. And in CFEngine, you never had a false model in the first place. You're always, central, it's individual, it's autonomous, local authority decides to accept decisions from the central point and operates on them, right? And so if it's compromised, it's now going to do something else. Someone just started talking. I don't know if that was on purpose or not. Looks like not. He muted himself. So anyway, that's yeah. So I just promise theory, and then CFEngine actually matches that model, and then you try and use another config management system, and they weren't built from that model, and it really shows. So anyway, that the rant.
Was there anything from Puppet that I mean, you think CFEngine, I mean, you mentioned Hyra, but like what other things would you, especially from some of your recent experience in other infrastructures, are there anything in CFEngine that you would maybe like to see some focus on?
Some changes and improvements. So the big one is provisioning. And it's not, properly speaking, the job of config management. But Foreman, like, so another little side story on this. Are you familiar with Red Hat, with Kickstart?
Yeah.
Okay. Are you familiar with Debian pre-seed files? Okay. So I was somewhat familiar with Kickstart. I wasn't familiar with Debian pre-seed files, and I assumed that they would be more or less, similar. And I was a little bit taken aback to find out how wild pre-seed files are. Because
they're wild.
They're really wild, because essentially it's like it's like the UI comes first. And the "are you sure" clicking confirmation. So you have to script all of that. And you have to put in a pre-seed instruction for every user prompt that you get during the installation. It's just like, it's kind of nuts. Anyway, so okay, fine. So there's this whole world of provisioning, and Foreman was created to solve the kind of the pain of provisioning new servers, right? Does pre-seeds really well. I think it works well with Kickstart and other things. And it integrates with Puppet. And then they later added, okay, you can integrate with Chef. I think you can integrate with other things. I don't think you can integrate it with CFEngine. I don't think there's been any kind of...
there's no high level support, but I mean, as far as I know, it's like a JSON or YAML response. And
yeah, nobody's really done the work of integrating. I don't know if anybody needs to do the work. But that was just sort of a pain point that I ran into at the company that didn't use CFEngine, where I was like, they were using Puppet that actually, and of course I won't name names and so forth, but I will say that the Puppet code base in use there was very old. I was upgrading it from Puppet 5 to Puppet 7. Puppet 5 has long been out of support, but the style of the code base was Puppet 3 or older. So I was, but I wasn't, the things I've said about Puppet best practices and so forth are mainly taken from my discussions in the Puppet Slack and reading the Puppet docs and so forth. So that's not so much old, but it did give me more of a historical lens for Puppet than I would have otherwise had. but the thing I was saying is that the reason I couldn't really make any case for like, hey, let's switch to CFEngine is because Foreman solved provisioning and Foreman integrated with Puppet. And it's like, what are you going to say to that? Like, okay, I want to switch to CFEngine, but we're still going to be using Foreman for our provisioning, and it's going to try and integrate with Puppet, and now Puppet isn't there. It's kind of like, yeah, fine. And of course, there's a whole existing code base in Puppet. I still honestly do think it would have been faster to rewrite the stuff in CFEngine than it would have been to upgrade from Puppet 5 to Puppet 7, particularly given the ancient style of that Puppet code base. But fine. So that's one thing. And let's see, you're asking about anything else needed changing in CFEngine side. So the other thing I guess I kind of touched on, and this is more philosophical, but make sure that def.json doesn't lose the knowledge management features of the CFEngine policy language. It sounds like there's some good abilities in that direction. And B, I would say try to make sure that this path eventually converges. If so, I think it might sound premature, honestly. It might sound like, we don't need that. But remember this conversation if somebody starts asking for more features in def.json because they're running into the pain that they can't do such and so complicated variable parsing or whatever.
They want to do a deep merge, and they want to resolve variables that are inside of policy before policy has loaded. Oh yeah, we've encountered a lot of that already. I think that the other extension that we made to def.json was the host-specific data support. So like there's two JSON files that'll be merged.
And for that one, that's where I would recommend looking into Hira, not because it's an example to follow, but you can see what problems they were trying to solve and how they went about solving them. And it might give you some ideas. It might give you bad ideas too. But you could also look at this as a cautionary tale. But the gist of Hira, there is. So once I got past all of the complexity of the particular old code base I was dealing with, and I actually understood how Hira is meant to be used, I was like, oh, this is actually a very nice system. Like, I like it. Like, it makes sense. So the basic idea of Hira is you can have the data override parameters. Essentially, it's the bundles, parameterized bundles, what you're passing to them. So just that, right? Just the arguments you're passing in. That's what you can override in Hira. Obviously, I'm mixing terminology, CFEngine Puppet. So you can do it at just one file, but then you'll do a merge. And so Hira, and the reason it's called Hira is it's a hierarchy of what, so you can have the host-specific one, you can have the site-specific one, you could have a role-based one, based on whatever the hell, right? And then you can have, like, of course, the global one. So, and generally speaking, that is approximately what you'd have, and you define that in your Hira.yaml that says, like, okay, this is the order that they go in, and then you can have, the host-specific one, and da-da-da-da-da, and you can just put it at whatever level. So that makes sense. There's always the question. It gets back to knowledge management, because where do you want that to live? Do you want it to live there? Do you want it to live in your mustache template? Maybe you're having a config file for resolve.conf, right? Or Etsy hosts, right? And it's going to be particular on different hosts and so on. You might want customizations here or there. I personally, if it's one file, I find it easier to read in the mustache template. You look at the mustache template, it's all there, right? So kind of everything pertaining to one file or service is in one place. Instead of, oh, here's the code that manages this service, and it says install from template. And you look at the template, and it says use these variables, and you look at the variables, and they might come from 18 different places at any level of your Hira or your def.json. That was my original objection to def.json, is it's like, how am I going to, like, it just kind of explodes the possible places to look for it. Instead of having all of your data pertaining to resolve.conf is right here. All of your data pertaining is right here. And then all of your data pertaining to classifying hosts and what classes do you set and how do you know your infrastructure, that's over here, right? So it's hard. It's knowledge management. It's you know, there's not one single easy answer, but I think that the danger to avoid there is adding more complexity to def.json, adding other things into def.json, and kind of getting further and further away from the knowledge management capabilities of CFEngine policy, to the point where you look at your CFEngine policy and you don't know anything that's going on because it's just a channel on which the massive amount of data in your def.json gets pumped through and put into configs on the system. And then you lose totally the knowledge management capabilities of CFEngine. So that's a very sort of philosophic directional objection. So but it's the trend. That's just where I see the natural pressures of user requirements and so forth pushing CFEngine in the long run, if it's not actively, you know, worked against.
So, what are you up to now? Are you done with Puppet Land?
I'm done with Puppet Land for the moment, unless I come into a job and they want me to do some Puppet, you know, I'd be open for it. I'm actually in a job hunt right now. So if any of your listeners are looking for some CFEngine expertise, I can do things besides CFEngine. It is definitely a specialty of mine, but Linux sysadmin and so forth. But I have a job hunt going. I have a few places that I'm expecting some offers in the coming couple weeks. So
how can somebody get a hold of you if
Mike Weilgart at gmail.com. I don't know if my last name will be showing on the podcast or whatever, but it should be in there, right?
It is showing.
Good. So yeah, just first name,
left corner.
Okay, great. So yeah, just first name, last name at gmail.com, and feel free to reach out if you also want to reach out and say, hey, can I see your resume? My resume, I actually don't mention CFEngine explicitly. I mention all sorts of accomplishments and config management and so forth. I just like specific technology, I just didn't bother to mention. But if you're hearing me here, then you know CFEngine, and yes, that's been my primary.
Is there some room for a little discussion still, or is it all over now?
Yeah, I think we're still recording.
We are.
No, no matter. I don't mind.
Okay. I didn't quite get the question, and I didn't get it directed at me.
There are two observations.
The
one is that at one point in your talk, you mentioned the fact that people don't understand what CFEngine is capable of doing. So it's an observation I share. But where did we go wrong? Because that's the way why people leave us. That's the reason why people leave us. They don't understand what it's about, and they don't understand. It's too difficult.
That's a fair one. Should I take a stab at that?
Yeah.
Okay. I think so. This is just my opinion. I haven't investigated this as like a research subject, but I think that there is a certain amount of there's a community point. There's a what's the name for the effect that places like Facebook have, networking effect, or that you kind of develop this critical mass and then people use it because other people are using it. So like the popularity of a programming language or system, and sometimes the reason why one becomes popular is because it's already popular enough that enough other people are using it. And it's like, okay, well, I'll use this because other people are using it, so I won't be a pioneer. I'll be able to follow in other people's footsteps. And I think that I think that Puppet is easy enough to get started on your own, and it doesn't scale well, but I think Puppet and Ansible have much more caught the hobbyist open source person playing around in their spare time market well. And so people who are just kind of messing around, doing their own thing, they tend to reach for Puppet or Ansible because it's like, okay, these are commonly used, I understand it, and so on. And then those people who are messing around and so forth, they go and they create a startup. And they use Puppet because that's what they're familiar with. And then maybe the startup gets a little bigger, then they run into the scaling issues that come with Puppet inevitably. But the person who started the company has that sort of liking for Puppet, Chef, Ansible, tool of choice, because that's what they used in their undergrad days when they were messing around on their own before they kind of went out and made their own company. So I think CFEngine does brilliantly well for the huge, massive enterprise scale system administration, and actually nothing else compares to it. I think in terms of like kind of growth in the long term and the decades long thing, I think CFEngine would need to do better at capturing the hobby market and making it a little bit easier for somebody who's like, they're trying to get going. It's like, how do I do this? Oh yeah, you install CFEngine, blah, blah, blah. It's like, here's your policy. So when somebody's messing around and it's like, oh, I want to install my own web server, I need to whatever, and they're just running into random blog posts and they're just following whatever instructions they're given, chances are they're going to be either told a manual setup instruction, pointed to Ansible, or pointed to Puppet, And if it's pointed to Ansible or Puppet, it'll be a step up from manual instructions, right? And it'll be like, oh, this is nice. The blog author said, like, yeah, you don't have to do any hard work. I wrote this Ansible playbook. I wrote this Puppet manifest. You just hit blah, blah, blah. And there you go. Now you're set up and you can use my goofy new system that I made myself. So that's my answer. What do you think on that, Nick?
I think that the change from the CFEngine 2 DSL to CFEngine 3 DSL was a big enough change that I think that was it had negative results on the community and things like that. There's also, CFEngine 2 is everywhere. Still, it's so many places, and CFEngine 2 hasn't seen a patch in since 2008, maybe 2010, maybe. But it's still in use. And then I think that I've also noticed some commonality with like personality types of CFEngine users, where they're often more conservative and more introverted, and often, if they're working at large global corporations, the employers are not so friendly with like sharing any information about like anything that you do. So I think that kind of has like some of that negative pressure effect. And CFEngine's not a spring chicken. 30 years CFEngine has been around, and
I feel like that's not a reason for it not. I feel like that's more you can say the same about Shell. Bash. How old is Bash, right? And
well, sure, but how often do you see people suggest that like you go use Bash for whatever the thing?
They don't need to suggest it because it's the default, because it's everywhere.
It's the default, but if somebody's going to go write some tool, I feel like more frequently they will reach for Python or like a higher level language. But
sure, but
CFEngine is
maybe a better example, GCC, or GDB. Take GDB, because the number of graphical debuggers, right? There's this whole plethora and variety of debuggers, and basically all of them use GDB under the hood. And so it's just kind of like, you get the tool, it's like, it's old, it doesn't matter. It does the job really, really well. So why would you go to something else? So I don't feel like the age is a reason to say it shouldn't be successful. I think if anything, the age is. I think you're more on point with your CFEngine 2 versus 3 split.
I think there's more to do with the age, because one of the other things that we hear about CFEngine from users or whatever, it's like, why is CFEngine 2 still installed everywhere? And it's because It just works. It just runs along in the background. It is easy to get into a position where this system is doing its job,
Mhm.
and therefore it does not demand my attention.
Right.
And so my attention goes elsewhere. And then I move on
Right.
to a different environment. I get hit by a bus. I retire. I whatever, right? And like it is not uncommon that we see, we talk to people with CFEngine that has been running in their environment for 20 years.
Yeah.
And it's not uncommon that we see cases, where like, oh, well, for X period of years, nobody touched it. It didn't get upgraded, or it's still on CFEngine 2, or they're still running 3.7, where like they
Do you
just
have any idea, Nick, about the amount of nodes that is still running CFEngine 2?
we have no way to know how many nodes are running any specific version because we don't put telemetry like that into any of the software.
Yeah,
But
there's no reporting home. I know of one company that is probably in the neighborhood of 100,000 nodes. Just that one company, CFEngine 2.
the largest
That's
single
a target.
install that we are aware of is over 3 million nodes.
Is that
Isn't
CFEngine
that-
2 or 3?
I
Two.
can't say.
Okay.
But isn't that the target for you, Nick, the CFEngine 2 guys?
Sure. I mean, we work with people to migrate from CFEngine 2 to 3, but I mean, just in the context of,
That's another one that was raised by.
CFEngine is very, it sometimes is seen as like old, right? It's not the new hotness or something like that. It's not what's being talked about by everybody in platform engineering or DevOps or whatever.
So I want to mention something on that because Alexei had a very good rebuttal to that, and Alexei, he first taught me CFEngine, so on. He learned CFEngine, by the way, directly from Mark Burgess. He was in some of his original classes on the subject, so I got this kind of immediate.
Well, Alexei is at fault for my use of CFEngine as well.
Oh, there you go. So he brought you on board. But his response would be to point out he knew the dates off the top of his head, and I don't. But he would point out that Chef and Puppet and Ansible, and I think there's another one as well, were all written before the CFEngine 3 rewrite. That they all post-date CFEngine 2, and they all predate CFEngine 3. So
I'd have to double check to see if they all predate CFEngine 3. I wanted to say that like Puppet was already in motion before CFEngine 3 came out.
Yeah, exactly. It predates
Yeah.
CFEngine 3. So they're older is the point. Like CFEngine 3 is the newer and the hotter compared to any of these others because it was written after them.
Mhm.
But also with the full knowledge of, the long history and experience with it of CFEngine 2.
Okay. Well, there is another one I wanted to raise because you had a lengthy discussion on dev.json, right? So it's about data. The data that's coming to the box for whatever reason, and the way we have it here, I guess it is in files, right?
Def.json is a file, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Was that Jay?
Well, no, it wasn't. It was just somebody in the background making enough noise that my mic picked it up.
Oh, okay.
Hey,
Well,
Martin.
well, that's
Go
what
ahead,
my
Mark.
talk is going to be about, Nick and Mike, because I'm going. Oh dear, I'm going to have this talk in Belgium in conflict management camp. It's on external data, so exactly what dev.json is about. So,
Mhm.
what I'm so curious about now, because you warned about the fact that you're going to lose control or whatever on knowledge management if you lean over to dev.json, Mike. Isn't that true?
That was my concern. It sounds that was initially
You
my
use-
concern, I was familiar with the 3.7 def.json where you couldn't have comment or meta attributes. So it sounds from what Nick is saying that that's been solved in 3.18 and later, so that's good news. Yeah. So I think the bigger question is, where does the knowledge come from? And it gets into the whole question of, how do you do rollouts? How do you do changes, and how do you roll them out? And that's kind of fundamental baked into. I'm the author of the CFEngine policy channels framework, which has been open sourced and so forth. And I can't imagine trying to do massive scale rollouts without using policy channels. So that enters into it a little bit also, because where do you make the change? Where does it take effect? How do you roll out? Who is supposed to be allowed to make the change, right? This all enters into it if you're going to get into def.json. One of the reasons for people using JSON instead of the policy language is because the people you want making changes don't know the CFEngine policy language, right? So it's kind of all tied up together there. Where do the changes come from? Who makes them? Who's allowed to make them? How do you roll them out? These all tie together, and this is all tied in with why would you use def.json at all?
Because I guess Mark Burgess would, in my view, share your concern, because we discussed this data thing, Mark and I. And he doesn't like the idea to have an external source for data.
I don't either. I'm really glad to hear that, because the fact that Hiera exists in Puppet, and it's like, okay, I get it. And then the fact that CFEngine and Northern Tech are kind of, Nick is a fan of def.json and has been since they're early. And I was kind of like, I don't really like that. And I'm actually really, I'd love to chat with Mark Burgess on the subject, because the fact that you're saying that he shares that concern, that makes me feel a little bit more bold about expressing what I really think. What I really think is that you should just put it in your damn policy. You should not be trying to use an external data source. And I kind of dropped away from that, bold position, because it's the opposite of what Nick is saying and what big companies are saying. But you asked for CFEngine best practices.
Well,
that's what I would say.
do have a use case. Suppose you know Nagios, I presume.
Somewhat, yeah.
Okay. So Nagios is a monitoring service, right? Okay, and it sits in the middle of a landscape.
Okay.
And it monitors nodes, agents, if you like, that are in the landscape. But it has no control over the agents that do exist in the landscape.
Okay.
So how are you going to provision this Nagios box with this dynamic landscape? So
you don't put it in policy, but you put the policy. So here's the question.
Yeah.
Where do you get the list of hosts in your environment?
Well, in line with the promise theory by Mark Burgess, I would be inclined to let the host himself provide the information to a source, and then let Nagios pull the information from this source.
So what I would say is it gets into the question of, where do new hosts come from, right? Because at some point you have, like, if it were just a static infrastructure, it doesn't really matter how you put it in there, right? You could hard code it in policy, but it's not a static infrastructure.
It's not static.
Right, it's not static.
Suppose you have a traffic, a big freeway with all the traffic on it. Those are all the agents that are around, and they have one way or another to get from the one end to the other, right? And they use either Google Maps, or they use Waze, whatever they use to get from A to B. But they are more or less self-governing.
Yeah. So what I would say is there's one really key question that has to be answered up front on that use case, which is how important is it to you that Nagios gets every single host? If there is a misbehaving host, and I have to sort of clarify that question.
It depends. Suppose this host is the one that is controlling the nuclear reactor. Okay, you might have a point that you want to be absolutely sure about its performance,
Well,
right?
or what I was thinking is more so if you're dealing with a security role, like you're going to have security check-ins or checking if you have vulnerabilities or something, then you really need to make sure you've got every host, right? And so you might approach it differently. If it's not that crucial, self-reporting might be totally fine. If it is that crucial, then you would go and look at where do new hosts come from, and can you make the provisioning system tell Nagios, hey, here's a new host, you should start monitoring.
Should you accept the host that is reporting itself? That's a good question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but that's the level at which I would solve it. I don't think it requires. So here's the thing: you can use JSON, like CFEngine, even without using def.json, you can write policy that's going to pull in a JSON file. Nothing wrong with that at all. You just write the promise, okay, go to this API, pull a JSON file and load it in, do something with it.
The point is that what I'm doing at the moment is not pulling it from a data file. It's pulling it from a message. What is it called? A 0MQ message. So you message a central source for the information, and in your reply is the information you want to have in JSON format.
Okay. So
the source extracts the information from a database.
That sounds fine. It also doesn't sound like something that you would put in def.json.
Changing too much to be in def.json. I mean, the type of dynamic stuff that you're talking about, you could do it with host specific data. That would kind of be maybe more appropriate if you're using some centrally collected information to determine how hosts themselves should be configured. Host specific data can be a good thing for that. And then as far as like this Nagios thing of how do you use this collected and this information from all of these other hosts to render like this central thing. I mean, with Nagios, I've heard some wild stuff. Like hosts generate their own configuration files, and then the Nagios server gets the configuration files from the host, either directly or via the hub, where they arrange for those host endpoint generated config files to be centralized on the hub, so that the Nagios servers can pull them off the hub. I mean, lots of different possibilities.
What is it, Nick? Is it configuration information or is it just operational information?
So I want to make one clarification point here, which is the point that I don't like about def.json is the human edited policy source of truth that is a JSON file rather than CFEngine policy language. I'm not against JSON as a format. I'm not against pulling data that's in JSON format from and using it to feed a policy and so forth. And in actual fact, if it's dynamic information of whatever sort, it doesn't make sense to try to hard code it in the first place. But what I'm saying is if you are hard coding something, and you're like kind of hard coding the mapping of like how your infrastructure looks like, I do feel that should be in your CFEngine policy language with all your comment tags and everything else that make it clear this is how it's supposed to look like, this is why it's this way, and all of that. And some of that's going to be fetch this dynamically generated information so that you can use it to make these predefined decisions as determined in CFEngine policy. It's when you get past using it like list of hosts or whatever, and you get past that and to the point of saying, do this on this host and this on this host and so on. Well, now you're doing your config via JSON, and then you get back to the knowledge management question, where does that knowledge come from? So for the case you're describing, I don't really see an issue, but I also don't see that it's not so much a point of separating the policy from the data, because the data is just what hosts exists. Like, where are the list of all of our hosts so we can monitor them in Nagios? And I don't really see that Like you're not going to hard code a list of hosts in your policy, not like
No,
an
no,
exhaustive
of course not.
list. So yeah.
No, no.
So
Well,
does that answer your question?
well, I'm preparing my talk in February.
Okay.
Yeah. And so it's good information for my talk because
Good.
I should have the arguments of the opposite, you know.
Why not separate your data from your code?
Yeah, in which case you might consider to apply it, and in which case you should not.
Yeah, so my answer on that is if your data, so-called, is actually decisions, then you get into what I think is an anti-pattern. And you have Puppet modules, for instance, that are written to do something 5,000 different ways, and you choose how it's going to work, right? So all of these parameters are actually Boolean flags saying do this or don't do this. And then you're hard coding this as or putting it as a host specific override. And that it's not really data, you see, it's actually a policy. You're saying don't have
Suppose you have a private key file
sure.
and a certificate. So a private key and a public key.
Sure. That's data. That's totally valid. What I'm
That's
talking
data.
about, what I'm talking about as data that shouldn't be separated from policy is something like should I have a web server installed? And if you call it's a Boolean, yes, no, right? Should I have a web server installed?
Yeah.
It's not really data. It's fundamental to the policy of what
Exactly.
you do.
So that's where you make the difference. So
Yeah.
suppose you have you may know what is it? Let's encrypt the certificates.
Mhm.
They're bugging you because they require you to refresh your certificate every 3 months, right?
I actually at a multi-billion-dollar company, I actually was on a team that was dealt with the TLS certificates and had an internal system for the automated installation and distribution of those. So yes, I know Let's Encrypt. Go ahead.
But you cannot put those files in a repository, for instance.
Right.
GitHub. So it's totally valid to have your policies on GitHub, from my point of view.
Agreed.
They are policies.
Agreed.
But
Yeah.
as soon as that you come to the point that you have SSH keys, passwords, in whatever encryption or what, or even certificates for websites or connections, well, then you need another source, right?
Right.
Then you cannot put them into a policy set.
Correct.
So that's what I'm looking for.
I think more of the separation of data and policy kind of about rates of change.
There's rates of change, but
space and time for
secrets is purely data, right? What I like data, it's fine to separate data from policy. The trick that people get into, the trap that they fall into, is separating data when the data is actually your policy.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, but sometimes you have top down, right? Like this host and that host are web servers.
Sure.
They are. I said so, right? And like that's data from the, like, okay, I want these two hosts to have this class.
Well, that's classification. So you classify that host as a web server, and then your policy is web servers should have this stuff installed. Exactly. That policy is just policy. And so it's kind of the context.
Right. It should install these packages, but that list of packages sometimes.
I don't think so.
Sometimes because there's two different so we see people doing stuff in bulk, right? Where it's like, I got 100,000 hosts I got to manage, and I need all these packages, and I already know what I need on my different types of hosts as far as software is concerned. And by and large, the majority of this software is just a list of packages that I want to be installed. So rather than encode this list of packages for the web server role directly into policy, you can use something like class filter CSV, where you have your class expression in the CSV, web servers, and then you have, whatever the tunable thing that you want for that
Okay,
to be this
fine.
list of
Sure.
packages. And then in your policy, it's one promise to install all of these packages that apply. Now, you can't do that with every single package as cleanly. Some packages, like Centrify, for example, might need special treatment where you can't just chuck it into this list of
Yeah, okay.
software that just needs to be installed, where you need to like handle it specially.
I mean, fine, sure. But now we're just talking about a vars list or like an S list being directly in policy versus having the same S list read in from data. It's
Yeah,
like,
but those things really govern your ability to deploy changes, who can
so
do it, separation of
sure.
concern.
Here's the thing that I would say. It still goes back to knowledge management, because where does that list come from? And if your list is coming from another source, and then sometimes it's overridden and whatever, you're gonna have, it's insane. You're gonna have way too much complexity. If the list lives in a single point of truth, and maybe it's even alongside your policy, maybe it's even in the same Git repository, and then it really doesn't really matter whether it's an S list defined in the policy or it's a CSV sitting right alongside it. They're in the same code base. They're always going to be in sync. And then it's just a question of, oh yeah, I put it in a CSV so people can modify it more easily. That's fine. But it's like, it's how
there are some other advantages. I gotta say, like class filter.
But I want to get back to what Martin was asking about, because Martin was talking about I feel like we kind of bypassed the point he brought up, which is about secrets. And that's a very valid question. And I want to mention that there's an underused feature of CFEngine is about, first of all, variables like remote variables, right? Vars that remote
it's enterprise only.
Oh, is it? Okay, fine. But CF server D and direct serving of files from one host to another without going through the hub is. And the access promise, right? So you say, yeah, I want to promise access to this file, but only to these specific IPs or this specific hash, this specific CFEngine key, right? This specific CFEngine identity. And I think that's really underutilized. And I think it goes very nicely in terms, how do we distribute this secret? So obviously the first question is, where does that key and certificate come from? And there's going to be like some host on which it gets pulled down, and like that's where it lives. And then you can say on the CFEngine policy for that host, say CF server D, have an access promise, and say this file should be made available to this specific host only. Yeah, go ahead.
And how would you manage that? Because I believe this was what Mark mentioned to me in the old days, but still it's file based, I guess.
It's file based, sure.
Yeah.
I mean, you could do it directory based. It kind of also depends on what's your certificate structure look like. Like, are you sharing the same certificate on many hosts, or do you have like one certificate per host? But either way, you just make your narrowly defined access promises so that only the hosts that are supposed to be able to get that private key can get it, and they'll fetch it from the place where you generated it. Or so you could generate it directly on the host. Yeah, I mean, there's different patterns, and frankly, I think with CFEngine, you really could do either pattern. That's not true in most config management systems.
But what I would think about is a central certificate server like a PKI that would store, for instance, all the certificates for all the different hosts.
Yeah,
Then you could make use of such a policy. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the alternative would be if every host is refreshing its own certs. But if you're using Let's Encrypt, you probably don't want to give access to, because I think with Let's Encrypt, I actually didn't use Let's Encrypt at that aforementioned multi-billion-dollar company. They, of course, used paid certificate authorities. But I believe with Let's Encrypt, you still need an account. You'd still use your API key and so forth. So, and I don't think you'd necessarily want that on every server. So yeah, you'd be looking at the one place where you have that, and that would do your certificate refreshes, and then you need to distribute it from there.
I used to work at a bank in the Netherlands, and they had their own PKI service. So for all the internal services, they use their own certificates.
Yeah, good. And if you've got internal, then then you can just refresh it directly from every host, and then you don't have to have the private keys live anywhere except on the host that's actually going to use it, which is definitely nice from a security standpoint. So I'm not sure if I answered your question. I'm also not sure if that was a question.
It's a discussion.
Okay, good.
It's okay. Well, it was nice to hear from you, Mike, because
Yeah.
because I
No,
heard
I don't
about
have a
you.
face. I'm trying to remember from the name. I'm usually good with faces. I'm not so good with names. Have we met
Well,
each other at
we
conference?
didn't meet, but I know Alexi as well.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
I think
Well,
I
Mike, just come to
remember.
Config Management Camp in February, and then
Oh
you'll get to
yeah.
see all the
Where is it?
faces. It's in Ghent in Belgium. It's the
Oh
registration just opened in the past few days, and I know you're on the West Coast, right?
yeah. Belgium's a little far for me.
You should come. You should come. It's actually like the only place that I know of where there is a conference dedicated to configuration management.
Yeah.
And it leans very heavily towards people who can get there by train. So Martin can basically walk there from
I even work in Ghent at the moment.
Nice.
Wow.
Well, it's a remote job.
Stew and
Now and then I
ribs.
get to Ghent. Ghent is beautiful, Mike.
Okay. Well, yeah. We should discuss this further. And I'll just
We had
reiterate.
we had Nick in the party all those years, but he's not going to come this time, I guess.
Oh man.
Yeah, not this
Oh,
year.
Not this
there you go.
year.
And Mike, it would be great because I'd love to discuss with you at some point how I deal with CFEngine, right? Like we actually, because I didn't know about the policy channels thing, which is something that would have solved problems for me in a big way because of the way we do tranches, right? So like your alpha host, everybody by the end of the week, like we know if we have any problems with policy or the data feeds it. I have literally
Nice.
no def.json. I also
Great.
have
That's how I like it.
I also have literally no hubs, right? So I've actually, because I couldn't solve the policy channels problem, I was we had hubs for every tranche in every network area. So our core, our co-location, our DMZ. And
Got it.
was a lot of infrastructure. So now I've replaced them with with Kerberized rsync servers. So now it lets us also split out the host specific data. So we have and had like a long time before I joined the company a CMDB, which is declarative. And it was originally built for building hosts, and that's how hosts are born. Around here is driven by our CMDB. It kind of turned into like the thing that we use for everything. It is a foundational service. So like if you own your own Linux home server, for example, you can update an access profile. So that access profile, we have some code that translates that into your host specific configurations. And when your host says, "Oh, it's time for me to run CFEngine," it goes and contacts from the list of Kerberized rsync servers. It gets tries in some order and pulls its policy, pulls the modules, pulls the configuration, the general configuration data, and then the host specific configuration data, and and then applies policy.
Gotcha. Yeah. We could actually have another whole episode talking about policy channels and how to do policy updates and policy distribution methods, because it's very fundamental to how to make any changes in an infrastructure, whether it's Puppet or CFEngine or anything else. It's like, how do you actually roll it out, and how do you do it safely, and how do you do it in a phased fashion? It's a very interesting topic. But yeah, I'd love to have that discussion with you. I doubt at the moment I'm going to be going to Belgium,
Okay.
And I want to reiterate because my job hunt mostly has just focused on general DevOps and sysadmin positions. So now I'm talking to this config management audience, and I actually would love to get back to doing that as a primary line of activity. So if there's an opening on your team, if you're listening to this, or whether you, Jay, or anybody else who hears it, I actually would love to hear about it. And feel free to reach out by email. I'm on the CFEngine, the help CFEngine. I might be on CFEngine dev. I don't remember. It might be an old email address that I was signed up on that one with, but or we can chat privately as well. Love to. Yeah. So
Okay.
Nick, what's the overall timing on this? Because I think are we
Oh, we're
past time?
Yeah, this
150%.
No, we're like hours. We're hours past. Hours past. So
Yeah.
this is a
This will
great
be our-
conversation. It's what I came for.
Okay,
This
will
good.
be our
typical
longest
Jay
episode
remark.
for sure.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, it's definitely, I mean, I would be surprised if the amazing editing team in post can get this cleaned up and posted today. I think it'll be.
Do we need to clean it up? Just post it all raw, right?
Okay.
We might
Hey,
do
Nick,
2 cuts of it.
Hey,
Maybe,
Nick,
yeah.
thank you for the answer you gave me on the help CFEngine. And I like the Nicholas Charles post as well.
I haven't gotten to my email yet this morning. I just fired off a quick response yesterday from bed, I think, when I saw your message about it, but
Thank you.
I'll have to check on that. Well,
Well,
I guess.
All right, but I think
Shall we,
I
shall
want
we
to say,
turn
Mike,
off recording and get on with more? Your email ahead of time said that we would have the recording portion and then the unrecorded portion for the live questions from the live audience. But I guess we're just recording all of it, which is okay with me.
So we usually have a like time where we ask if there's questions. Often there's not a whole lot of discussion from people who attend live. This time there was more.
I'm very opinionated. It probably helps drive discussion. Martin, were you about to ask something or say something?
No. I have to take into account that you still have to work today. Or not? Or have you?
Or not? As I mentioned, I'm in a job hunt at the moment. I'm still on my little
Okay,
break
you're in a
here.
job hunt. So this is
So,
work.
Yeah,
But
this
Nick and
is work
Jay
related.
are going to work, I guess, or not?
Yeah.
well, I've been at work. I actually took a small break from my team's stand up
Okay.
about an hour ago.
Okay, yeah. Well, I hope to see you in Ghent, Jay.
Oh, you shall. Yeah.
You guys have
I
some
just-
many ribs for me and some Ghent stew, maybe.
Probably some Genton too. Stu, probably a couple of beers on your behalf.
Yes,
Yeah,
please.
a couple.
Now, Mike, I did like your idea of a future. It's just an idea for a future, a future the agent is in, a future webinar about things like policy channels, right? How do you what we refer to as how do you control the blast radius?
Yeah.
Jay.
I'm not even
Maybe
going to
come on
touch
and
the
have that
subject now
discussion
because
with
we're so
Mike.
far over time. But I agree. I think it would be a
Yeah.
wonderful discussion.
Yes.
Cool. All right. Well, let me. Thanks for joining us for episode 32 of The Agent is In, and we'll see you next month when we talk with Mark Burgess.
Ooh,
Okay,
Wow.
when will he be in?
nice.
Oh, it's
In a month.
it's
Next
a nice
episode.
discussion to have a recap of the discussion we had on JSON, etc.
Yeah, we'll have to ask him and see what Mark thinks about def.json.
Yeah.
I know that he prefers everything to be in policy, but content-driven policies is also a thing from a long time ago, which is a lot of this external data thing.
Hey, who doesn't love that?
It ties in with policy channels. It ties in with how do you deploy changes. It's almost the same discussion. Because if your def.json lives exactly coexistent with your policy, then it doesn't really matter, right? It's just
high level priming for that policy set. Yeah.
Well, I'm saying if it's distributed all the same way, it just as though it's another policy in your policy set, then it's kind of just a format
then it's just a format thing. So then you're
Right.
only, there's definitely levels to like all these things that you can do and trade-offs for doing any of them. I
I'm
like
trying to
having
allow
those
us to
discussions
end
of
off.
like, fight it out, figure out like what information do we need, how can we get it, who can we share it with. I
Yeah.
find those conversations the most interesting in people's infrastructure, because a lot of times that's not how it's thought about.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. So we definitely need to have a follow-up one, but I'm looking forward to hearing what Mark has to say.
Yeah.
All right.
30 years of
Yeah,
CFEngine.
okay.
All right. So thanks for joining us for episode 32. We'll see you
Yeah.
again next month where we talk to Mark Burgess. And
Okay.
thanks for
Thanks
joining.
for having me on.